The radio operator's hand trembled as he transcribed the coded message. It was May 1942, and somewhere in the basement of a nondescript building in Pearl Harbor, a team of exhausted cryptanalysts had just deciphered something that would change the course of human history. The message was simple, barely a few characters, but its meaning was profound. The Japanese Imperial Navy was planning something massive. The target? A tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean called Midway. What followed would become the most decisive naval battle of World War II, won not by superior firepower or larger fleets, but by the invisible war of intelligence, deception, and the brilliant minds who could break unbreakable codes. 6 months earlier, the world had been a different place. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered American confidence and drawn the United States into a war it had desperately tried to avoid. The attack was devastating. Battleships lay twisted and burning in the Hawaiian waters. Thousands of American servicemen died in minutes. The Pacific Fleet, America's shield in the ocean, had been crippled in a single morning. Japan's military machine seemed unstoppable, a force of nature sweeping across Asia and the Pacific like a tsunami. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces captured Hong Kong, invaded Malaya, overwhelmed the Philippines, and pushed deep into Burma. Their carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, was the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled, and it had never known defeat. But hidden within the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, something had survived. While battleships burned and sank, the American aircraft carriers had been at sea, spared from destruction by chance or fate. And in the basement offices and converted storage rooms scattered across Hawaii, a different kind of warrior had already begun fighting back. These warriors wore no uniforms adorned with medals. They carried no rifles. Their battlefield was silence, patience, and the human mind's capacity to find patterns in chaos. They were codebreakers, and they were about to orchestrate one of the most extraordinary intelligence operations in military history. The leader of this shadow war was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a man whose appearance suggested anything but a military genius. He often worked in a red smoking jacket and carpet slippers, pacing the concrete floors of Station HYPO, the cryptanalysis center at Pearl Harbor. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. None of them had. The war in the Pacific moved at a brutal pace, and every intercepted message might contain the key to saving thousands of lives or losing entire fleets. Rochefort's team worked around the clock in a windowless basement, surrounded by mountains of paper, the constant clatter of typewriters, and the mechanical clicking of primitive computing machines. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee. These men were fighting exhaustion, fighting time, and fighting the most complex naval code ever created. The Japanese had absolute faith in their primary naval code, which the Americans designated JN25. It was a massive, sophisticated cipher system involving thousands of 5-digit code groups, each representing words, phrases, or concepts, then encrypted again through additive tables that changed regularly. Japanese naval commanders believed it was unbreakable. They transmitted their most secret operational plans through JN25, confident that even if the enemy intercepted their radio signals, the messages would remain incomprehensible gibberish. What they didn't know was that American cryptanalysts had been quietly chipping away at this code for months, building dictionaries of recovered code groups, identifying patterns, exploiting small mistakes in transmission, and gradually illuminating the darkness. By April 1942, Rochefort's team could read perhaps 40% of intercepted Japanese naval messages. It wasn't complete, but it was enough to glimpse the shape of enemy intentions. And what they saw terrified them. After the Doolittle raid in April, when American bombers had launched from an aircraft carrier and struck Tokyo itself, the Japanese high command was enraged and humiliated. The raid had done minimal physical damage, but the psychological wound was deep. The Japanese home islands were supposed to be invulnerable, protected by thousands of miles of ocean and the invincible Imperial Navy. That illusion had shattered. Now, the intercepted messages revealed frantic Japanese planning for a massive operation, something that would eliminate the American carrier threat forever and extend Japan's defensive perimeter so far into the Pacific that no enemy could ever threaten the homeland again. But there was a problem. The Japanese messages referred to the target using only a code designation. F. Rochefort's team could see troop concentrations being organized, carrier groups being assembled, and invasion forces preparing to sail. They could read about objectives, timelines, and force compositions. But where was a F? Some intelligence officers in Washington believed a F might be Hawaii itself, another devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. Others thought it might be the Aleutian Islands, or even the west coast of America. The fate of the Pacific War hung on two letters, AF. Rochefort had a theory. For weeks, he had noticed patterns in the messages that suggested AF was Midway, a tiny coral atoll roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was strategically vital. It housed an American naval air station and served as an early warning outpost. If Japan captured Midway, they could threaten Hawaii directly and force the American carriers into a decisive battle on Japanese terms. Everything in the intercepted messages fit this theory, but Washington was skeptical. Rochefort needed proof, something undeniable that would convince the admirals to commit America's precious few remaining carriers to defend Midway. So Rochefort and his team devised a trap, a deception so elegant and so risky that it would become legendary in intelligence history. They convinced the Midway garrison to send an uncoded radio message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down and they were running short of drinking water. The message was transmitted in plain English, deliberately allowing the Japanese to intercept it. Then Rochefort's team waited, listening to Japanese naval communications with the intensity of hunters at a waterhole. Within days, they intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of fresh water. The trap had worked. AF was Midway. The proof was irrefutable. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, made a decision that would define his legacy. He believed Rochefort. Despite opposition from intelligence officers in Washington, despite the risk of committing his outnumbered carriers based on partially decrypted messages, Nimitz ordered his forces to prepare for battle at Midway. The Americans would not wait to be attacked. They would set their own trap. Every available ship, every aircraft, every Marine and sailor would converge on Midway. And when the Japanese fleet arrived, expecting surprise and easy victory, they would instead find an enemy waiting in ambush, guided by intelligence that penetrated their deepest secrets. The Japanese plan was ambitious and complex, perhaps too complex. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, designed an operation involving multiple fleet groups spread across thousands of miles of ocean. A diversionary force would attack the Aleutian Islands far to the north, drawing American attention away from the real target. The main invasion force, protected by 4 fleet carriers and their escorts, would approach Midway from the northwest, launch devastating airstrikes to neutralize the island's defenses, then land troops to capture the atoll. And waiting far to the west would be Yamamoto himself, aboard the massive battleship Yamato, ready to spring a trap on any American carriers foolish enough to respond. The plan assumed surprise. It assumed the Americans would be scattered and reactive. It assumed that Japanese naval intelligence was superior. Every one of these assumptions was wrong. As May turned to June, the greatest naval forces in the Pacific began moving toward their destiny. The Japanese armada was staggering in size and power. 4 fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiru, and Soryu veterans of Pearl Harbor and every major Japanese victory carried nearly 300 aircraft. Escorting them were battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, along with transport ships carrying thousands of invasion troops. The Japanese commanders were confident, almost jubilant. They were about to eliminate the last American resistance in the Pacific and Antaig, secure an empire that would endure for 1,000 years. But approaching from the east, guided by the invisible hand of intelligence, came the American force. It was smaller, desperately outnumbered. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Admiral Frank Fletcher commanded Task Force 17, centered on the carrier Yorktown, which had been so badly damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea just weeks earlier that Japanese intelligence believed it was sunk. In an extraordinary feat of engineering, Pearl Harbor shipyard workers had repaired Yorktown in just 72 hours, working day and night, welding steel and patching flight decks while the crew loaded ammunition and supplies. The ship wasn't fully operational, but it could fight. And that would have to be enough. Nimitz's orders to his carrier commanders were based entirely on the intelligence provided by Rochefort's team. He told them exactly where the Japanese would approach, what time they would arrive, what course they would sail, and how their forces would be organized. It was as if the Americans possessed a divine vision of the future. Fletcher and Spruance positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, beyond the range where Japanese reconnaissance would expect to find them. They maintained radio silence, drifting like ghosts on the empty ocean, and they waited. June 4th, 1942, dawned clear and bright over the Pacific. At 4:30 in the morning, Japanese carriers turned into the wind and began launching their strike wave against Midway. 108 aircraft roared off the flight decks bombers, fighters, torpedo planes flying south toward the tiny atoll. The Japanese pilots were the best in the world, veterans of countless battles, supremely confident. Behind them on the carrier decks, ground crews prepared a second wave of aircraft, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against any American ships that might appear. The Japanese commanders believed they had hours of security, time to destroy Midway's defenses before dealing with any American response. But at 5:34 in the morning, a Navy Catalina patrol plane flying from Midway spotted the Japanese carrier force. The pilot immediately radioed his sighting report. The trap was about to spring. At 5:52, another Catalina spotted the incoming Japanese strike wave. On Midway itself, air raid sirens wailed across the island. Every aircraft that could fly scrambled into the air-obsolete fighters, lumbering bombers, torpedo planes, so old they belonged in museums. The defenders of Midway knew they were overmatched, but they would buy time with their lives if necessary. The Japanese strike hit Midway with devastating precision. Buildings exploded. Fuel tanks erupted in flames. The airfield was cratered by bombs. But the Americans had been warned by intelligence. Most of the aircraft had already launched. The facilities were damaged, but not destroyed. And crucially, the Japanese strike commander radioed back to his carriers that a second attack would be necessary to completely neutralize Midway's defenses. This message would change everything. On the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Keiichi Nagamo faced a decision. His second-wave aircraft were on deck, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships. But Midway still had fight left in it. Should he rearm his aircraft with land attack bombs for a second strike against the island? It seemed the logical choice. Japanese reconnaissance had found no sign of American carriers. Nagamo ordered the rearmament. Below decks and on the hangar decks, ordnance crews frantically began removing torpedoes and replacing them with bombs. Torpedoes and bombs were stacked temporarily on the hangar decks. The carriers were in their most vulnerable state. Decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed, fuel lines open, ammunition exposed. At 7-20-8 in the morning, everything changed. A Japanese reconnaissance plane, delayed in launching by a mechanical problem, finally radioed a sighting report. American ships, including what appeared to be a carrier, had been spotted northeast of the Japanese force. Nagamo was stunned. The Americans were supposed to be days away from Midway, if they came at all. Now he faced a nightmare scenario. His strike wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. His second wave was being rearmed with the wrong weapons. And somewhere out there, American carrier aircraft might already be inbound. Admiral Nagamo made another fateful decision. He would wait to recover his returning planes from Midway before launching a properly armed attack on the American carriers. This meant the frantic rearming process had to be reversed again. Below decks, chaos reigned. Japanese crews scrambled to swap land attack bombs for torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The hangar decks were a dangerous maze of scattered munitions, snaking fuel hoses, and aircraft packed wingtip to wingtip. Meanwhile, the American carriers had already launched their own strike. Armed with crucial intelligence, Admirals Fletcher and Spruance knew exactly where to find the enemy. At 7 a.m., Enterprise and Hornet began sending their planes aloft, with Yorktown following an hour and a half later. Wave after wave of dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters climbed into the morning sky, flying to the absolute edge of their operational range. Many pilots knew they wouldn't have enough fuel to make it back. They flew anyway. The American attack almost ended in disaster. The Japanese fleet had changed course, and the American strike groups couldn't find them. Fuel gauges crept towards empty. Some squadrons turned back, others searched desperately. The torpedo bomber squadrons from Hornet and Enterprise found the Japanese carriers first. Flying slow, obsolete Devastator aircraft without fighter escort, they were sitting ducks. The Japanese combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire tore them apart. All 15 torpedo bombers from Hornet were shot down. Only 4 of 14 from Enterprise survived. Just 2 of Yorktown's 12 made it back. Not a single torpedo hit its mark. It seemed like a pointless sacrifice. But it wasn't. Those doomed attacks accomplished something vital. They pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, disrupting the carrier's defensive screen. For a fleeting moment, the skies directly above the Japanese fleet were wide open. And at precisely that moment, 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers arrived high above. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bombers from Enterprise, had pushed his search to the very limit. Just as he was about to give up, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast. In a brilliant flash of insight, he realized it must be rushing to rejoin its fleet. He followed its wake, and there they were. The sight below was a pilot's dream. 4 Japanese carriers, caught at their most vulnerable. Their decks were crowded with planes being armed and fueled. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines were strewn across the hangar decks. The returning Midway strike force was circling, waiting to land, and the entire Japanese fighter patrol was down at wave-top height. The carriers were utterly defenseless. McCluskey gave the signal. 37 dive bombers rolled into their screaming descent from 17,000 feet. The Japanese lookouts saw them far too late. At 10:24 a.m., the first American bomb slammed into the carrier Kaga, piercing the flight deck and exploding in the hangar, packed with fueled and armed planes. A catastrophic chain reaction began. Bombs detonated, torpedoes cooked off, and fuel fires spread instantly. In seconds, Kaga was a floating inferno. Simultaneously, bombs struck Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. Fires engulfed the carrier within minutes as explosions ripped through her hangar decks. Dive bombers from Yorktown and found Soryu. 3 bombs hit in quick succession, and just like her sisters, she erupted in flames. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's finest fleet carriers were burning wrecks. Half a year of Japanese dominance in the Pacific ended in 6 minutes of American fury. But it wasn't over. One carrier, Hiryu, had escaped the initial onslaught. Her commander immediately launched a counterstrike. His planes found the Yorktown and hammered her with bombs and torpedoes, leaving her dead in the water. But the Americans were relentless. Scout planes located Hiryu. Every available dive bomber from Enterprise and Yorktown was sent to finish the job. Late that afternoon, they found Hiryu preparing her next strike and smashed her with bombs. By evening, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning or sinking. The most powerful carrier force ever assembled had been wiped from the seas. Thanks for watching. If you found this story of courage and consequence as fascinating as I do, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time. 6 months, that's all it took. 6 months after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy seemed invincible. They had swept across the Pacific, conquering territories from Southeast Asia to the remote islands of the Central Pacific. The Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies all had fallen. The Allied forces were on the defensive, reeling from defeat after defeat. For Japan, the path to dominating the entire Pacific Ocean seemed wide open. Their next target? A tiny remote atoll known as Midway. Why Midway? From a strategic standpoint, it was brilliant. Midway is, just as its name suggests, about halfway between North America and Asia. For the Japanese, capturing it would serve 2 critical purposes. First, it would eliminate a forward operating base for the Americans, pushing their defensive line all the way back to Hawaii or even the West Coast. Second, and more importantly, it was bait. The commander of Japan's combined fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was a gambler. He knew the U.S. Pacific Fleet, though wounded, was still a threat. He wanted to lure the remaining American aircraft carriers into a decisive battle, a final showdown where he could annihilate them and secure Japan's naval supremacy for years to come. The plan was audacious, complex, and in Yamamoto's mind, foolproof. He assembled a massive armada, the largest naval force the world had ever seen, with over 200 ships, including 8 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, and hundreds of planes. Against this overwhelming force, what did the Americans have? The American situation in May 1942 was dire. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz, had just 3 aircraft carriers available: the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the USS Yorktown. And the Yorktown was in terrible shape. It had been badly damaged just a month earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea and had limped back to Pearl Harbor. Experts estimated it would take 3 months to repair. Nimitz gave the shipyard workers 3 days. In a Herculean effort, they patched the Yorktown up, getting it just barely battle-ready. So, 3 American carriers against a force that was supposed to include at least 4 of Japan's best. The odds were not good, but the Americans had a secret weapon, an ace up their sleeve that would change everything: intelligence. This is where the story takes a turn worthy of a spy thriller. Deep in a basement office in Pearl Harbor, a team of brilliant but eccentric codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been working tirelessly to crack Japan's naval code, JN-25. They were a motley crew, known for wearing slippers and smoking jackets to work, but their genius was undeniable. By late May, they were intercepting and deciphering fragments of Japanese communications. They started seeing repeated references to a major operation targeting a location designated AF. Rochefort and his team were convinced AF was Midway, but Washington was skeptical. They needed proof. So Rochefort devised a clever ruse. He instructed the base at Midway to send out an unencrypted radio message in plain English, claiming their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. It was a calculated gamble. Sure enough, a few days later, the codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message. AF is short on fresh water. That was it. The smoking gun. Nimitz now knew Yamamoto's target and could prepare an ambush. He moved his 3 carriers into a position northeast of Midway, a spot codenamed Point Luck, where they could lie in wait, undetected, ready to strike the Japanese flank. The stage was set for one of the most pivotal naval battles in history. Yamamoto thought he was setting a trap, but he was sailing directly into one. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the battle began. Just as predicted, the first wave of Japanese planes, bombers and Zero fighters, took off from their carriers to attack Midway Island. The American defenders on the island fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed. The initial Japanese strike was successful, heavily damaging the base. The Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, received a report from his strike leader recommending a second attack on the island to finish the job. At this point, Nagumo made a fateful decision. His reserve planes were armed with torpedoes, ready to attack any American ships that might appear. But with the report from Midway and no sign of the American fleet, he ordered his crews to rearm the planes with land attack bombs. This rearming process was chaotic and time-consuming. Torpedoes had to be taken off, bombs had to be loaded on. The flight decks of the Japanese carriers were a whirlwind of activity, littered with fuel lines, carts of explosives, and aircraft. It was at this exact moment of maximum vulnerability that a Japanese scout plane finally spotted the American fleet. The message sent Nagumo into a panic. American carriers. He had to switch back to torpedoes immediately. More chaos ensued. Bombs off, torpedoes on. The decks were a mess of unsecured ordnance. And then, the first American planes appeared on the horizon. The initial American attacks were a disaster. Torpedo bombers from the Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown flew in low and slow, without fighter escort. They were sitting ducks for the nimble Japanese Zero fighters and the carrier's anti-aircraft guns. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, 37 were shot down. It was a slaughter. Not a single torpedo hit its mark. These pilots were incredibly brave, flying into almost certain death, but their sacrifice seemed to be in vain. However, their doomed attack had an unintended, crucial consequence. They had pulled the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the Zero fighters. down to sea level to deal with the low-flying torpedo planes. This left the skies directly above the Japanese carriers wide open. And that's when everything changed in the span of just 5 minutes. As the last of the American torpedo bombers were being wiped out, high above, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived. They had been searching for the Japanese fleet, and almost by chance, found them at their most vulnerable moment. Led by commanders like Wade McCluskey and Max Leslie, they peeled off and plunged down towards the Japanese carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. With the Japanese fighter cover out of position, the dive bombers faced little opposition. They were unopposed. Bomb after bomb slammed into the cluttered flight decks, igniting the fuel, the unsecured bombs, and the planes themselves. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers were transformed into raging infernos. It was a scene of utter devastation. A 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, which was sailing separately, managed to survive the initial onslaught. It quickly launched its own counterattack. Its dive bombers found the USS Yorktown and hit it 3 times, leaving it dead in the water and burning. It seemed the Yorktown's luck had finally run out. But the battle wasn't over. American scout planes located the Hiryu later that afternoon. A final strike was launched from the Enterprise, and the last of Nagumo's carriers was hit and set ablaze. By the end of the day, all 4 of the powerful Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were either sunk or sinking. The core of Japan's naval air power had been wiped out in a single day. The Battle of Midway was an astounding victory for the United States, a true turning point in the Pacific War. Japan lost 4 of its best carriers, a heavy cruiser, and over 250 aircraft. More importantly, they lost over 3,000 men, including many of their most experienced and irreplaceable pilots. The Americans, in contrast, lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, 1 destroyer, and about 150 planes. The lopsided victory was a result of courage, sacrifice, and crucially superior intelligence. The codebreakers of Station HYPO had given the U.S. Navy a decisive edge. The battle shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and halted their eastward expansion. From this point forward, the initiative in the Pacific shifted to the Allies. The long, bloody road to Tokyo began at Midway. The brave men who fought and died there, from the codebreakers in their basement to the pilots in their cockpits, changed the course of world history in just a few fateful days. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the past. Let us know in the comments what historical event you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video.